They thought they had found the perfect way to silence the message, not by fighting it, not by destroying it, but by bending it, reshaping it, turning it into something harmless, something that could coexist with their idols and preserve their power. In that tense moment, when truth stood face to face with compromise, something extraordinary was about to unfold, something that would define the boundaries of faith forever. Before we go deeper into this powerful story, take a moment to connect, share where you are watching from, and if this kind of content speaks to you, consider subscribing so you can continue exploring the depth and beauty of Islam together. Mecca, at that time, was not just a city. It was a center of influence, a place where religion, politics, and trade were tightly woven together. The Kaaba stood at its heart, built originally for the worship of Allah alone, but over generations it had been filled with idols, each one representing a tribe's identity and pride. Pilgrims came from across Arabia, not only to worship, but to trade, to form alliances, and to reinforce a system that benefited the powerful. The leaders of Quraysh understood this system deeply, and they guarded it fiercely. Then came a message that did not attack them with weapons or armies, but with something far more unsettling, a call to abandon every idol, to reject every false god, and to submit fully to the one Creator. It sounded simple, but it carried a weight that shook the very foundations of their society. If people accepted this message, the idols would lose their meaning, the rituals would lose their purpose, and the authority of those who controlled them would begin to crumble. At first, many dismissed it as just another voice, something that would fade with time. But it did not fade. It grew. Quietly, steadily, it began to take root in hearts that had long searched for truth. The poor heard it and found dignity in it. The oppressed heard it and found justice in it. Even among those with status, there were some who recognized its truth despite the cost. This is what frightened the leaders the most. It was not just the message itself, it was the way it spread, crossing social boundaries, breaking down divisions, uniting people under something they could not control. They tried ridicule, hoping to make it seem foolish. They tried pressure, hoping to isolate the Prophet and his followers. They tried threats, hoping fear would stop the movement. But nothing worked. The message remained steady and unshaken, and with every passing day it became clearer that this was not something that could be easily silenced. So they began to think differently. If force could not stop it, perhaps strategy could contain it. They gathered, the most influential among them, men who understood negotiation, who knew how to maintain power without direct confrontation. They realized that the Prophet was not driven by wealth, not tempted by status, and not afraid of their threats. That made him difficult to control. But maybe, just maybe, there was another way. What if they could bring him into a shared arrangement, something that would appear peaceful on the surface but would weaken the purity of his message from within? It was a calculated idea, subtle and dangerous, because it did not aim to destroy the message outright. It aimed to dilute it. When they approached him, they did so with a tone that seemed reasonable, almost diplomatic. They did not insult him in that moment, nor did they threaten him. Instead, they offered what they believed was a fair compromise. They said, "Worship our gods for a year, and we will worship your God for a year. Let there be a balance, a shared understanding, a way for both sides to coexist without conflict." To them, this was brilliant. It preserved their traditions while acknowledging his growing influence. It allowed them to maintain control while appearing open and cooperative. But beneath that proposal was a fundamental misunderstanding. They treated truth as if it were something flexible, something that could be divided and rotated like a shared responsibility. They did not realize that what the Prophet brought was not a negotiable idea. It was a revelation from Allah, something that demanded complete sincerity and absolute devotion. In that moment, the weight of the situation was immense. This was not simply a proposal about rituals or practices. It was a challenge to the very core of faith. Accepting even a part of it would mean recognizing false worship as something acceptable, even if only temporarily. It would blur the line between truth and falsehood, and once that line is blurred, it becomes almost impossible to restore. The Prophet understood this clearly. He knew that this was not about finding peace through compromise. It was about protecting the integrity of the message entrusted to him. And while the leaders of Quraysh believed they had found a clever solution, they were standing on the edge of a response that would leave no room for ambiguity, no space for negotiation, and no doubt about where truth stands. There are moments in history when everything seems to pause, when the weight of a single decision carries consequences far beyond what anyone present can fully grasp. And this was one of those moments. The proposal placed before the Prophet was not wrapped in hostility. It did not come with raised voices or threats, and that was precisely what made it so dangerous. It came dressed as peace, as balance, as a way to avoid conflict and preserve unity, yet beneath that calm surface was something far more serious. It was an invitation to blur the line between truth and falsehood, to treat divine revelation as something that could be adjusted, negotiated, or shared with practices that stood in direct opposition to it. The leaders of Quraysh believed they were offering a clever solution, but in reality they were presenting a test that would define the very nature of Islam itself. If this offer were accepted, even partially, it would not simply be a temporary compromise. It would open the door to endless distortions, where truth could be reshaped whenever pressure arose. The Prophet understood this with complete clarity. He knew that the message he carried was not his own to modify, not something he could soften to make others comfortable, and not something that could be mixed with the worship of idols. It was a trust from Allah, pure and uncompromised, and it demanded to remain exactly as it was revealed. The atmosphere around him must have been charged with expectation. The leaders of Quraysh were waiting, confident in their strategy, convinced that they had finally found a way to neutralize this growing movement without direct confrontation. To them, this was not surrender, it was control. If the Prophet agreed, even symbolically, it would validate their beliefs and weaken the distinction between their practices and his message. It would allow them to claim that all paths were equal, that all forms of worship could coexist, and that the call to abandon idols was not absolute after all. But what they failed to understand was that the message of Islam does not operate within that kind of framework. It does not recognize partial truth when it is mixed with falsehood, and it does not allow devotion to be divided between the Creator and created things. In that moment, the question was not how to avoid conflict, it was how to preserve truth in its purest form. The weight of that responsibility rested entirely on the shoulders of the Prophet, and there was no room for hesitation, no space for uncertainty, because any sign of compromise would echo far beyond that single encounter. Then, at the height of this tension, revelation came. Not as a suggestion, not as a gradual explanation, but as a decisive answer that cut through every layer of ambiguity. Surah Al-Kafirun was revealed, and with it came a response that did not negotiate, did not soften, and did not leave room for reinterpretation. It addressed the situation directly, confronting the idea of compromise with a clarity that could not be misunderstood. This was not merely a rejection of their proposal. It was a declaration that defined the boundaries of faith for all time. The words were simple, yet their impact was immense, because they established something fundamental, that truth is not subject to negotiation, and that worship belongs to Allah alone without any partners, without any blending, and without any exception. In a world where people often seek middle ground to avoid tension, this revelation stood as a reminder that some matters cannot be compromised without losing their essence entirely. When the command came to say, "O disbelievers," it carried a directness that might seem striking, but it was necessary. It was not an insult, nor was it a dismissal rooted in arrogance. It was a statement of reality, an acknowledgement of the clear difference between belief and disbelief. There was no attempt to hide that difference behind vague language or polite ambiguity. Instead, it was brought into the open, defined clearly so that there would be no confusion about where each side stood. This clarity was essential because the proposal itself was built on the illusion that both sides could meet in the middle, that differences could be smoothed over for the sake of harmony. But true harmony cannot exist when it is built on a foundation of compromised truth. By addressing them in this way, the revelation removed any false sense of unity that might have been created by their offer. The following words reinforce this separation with unwavering firmness. I do not worship what you worship. This was not a temporary refusal, not a statement limited to that specific moment, but a permanent declaration. It made it clear that the Prophet would never participate in idol worship, not even as a gesture, not even for the sake of peace. It was a rejection that left no room for negotiation, because the act of worship itself is not something that can be shared between truth and falsehood. Worship defines allegiance, and allegiance in Islam belongs entirely to Allah alone. To divide it, even briefly, would be to undermine its very meaning. The leaders of Quraysh may have seen their proposal as balanced, but this verse exposed its flaw completely. It showed that there is no balance between worshipping the Creator and worshipping created things because the two are fundamentally opposed. Then came the mirror of that statement, turning the focus back toward them. Nor are you worshippers of what I worship. This was not simply a response. It was a clarification of reality. Even if they acknowledged Allah in some form, their practices had distorted that recognition. They associated partners with Him, they placed idols as intermediaries, and they shaped their worship according to traditions that had no basis in true monotheism. So while they might claim to worship the same God, their actions told a different story. This verse made it clear that true worship is not defined by claims alone. It is defined by sincerity and adherence to the truth as revealed by Allah. Without that, the essence of worship is lost, no matter how many rituals are performed. What makes this moment so powerful is not just the firmness of the response, but the timing of it. It came precisely when compromise seemed most tempting, when the pressure to find a peaceful resolution was at its peak. In that context, the revelation did not offer a middle path. It drew a clear line. It showed that maintaining peace at the cost of truth is not true peace at all, but a temporary illusion that leads to greater confusion and loss in the long run. The Prophet's role was not to reshape the message to fit the expectations of those around him, but to deliver it exactly as it was given, regardless of the consequences. And so the response stood, strong and unyielding, not driven by hostility but by clarity, not rooted in conflict but in conviction. It established a principle that would guide believers for generations to come, that faith is not something to be adjusted under pressure, and that the worship of Allah cannot be shared, diluted, or negotiated. In a world that often seeks compromise as a solution to every difference, this moment remains a powerful reminder that some truths are meant to stand firm, untouched by the shifting demands of society, anchored in a certainty that does not change. There is a kind of clarity that does not shout, does not argue endlessly, and does not bend itself into complicated explanations just to be accepted. It simply stands, firm and unmistakable, and that is exactly what these words carried when they were revealed. I do not worship what you worship. It sounds simple, almost brief, but inside it is a weight that reshapes everything. This was not a defensive statement, not something spoken out of frustration or reaction, but a declaration rooted in certainty. It closed every door that the leaders of Quraysh thought they had opened with their proposal. They imagined a shared space, a rotation of beliefs, a blending of practices that could keep everyone satisfied. But this statement erased that illusion completely. It made it clear that worship is not an activity that can be negotiated like a trade agreement or adjusted like a social custom. Worship is the deepest expression of belief, the purest reflection of what the heart recognizes as truth. And once it is directed toward anything other than the Creator, it loses its meaning entirely. What makes this even more powerful is that it did not leave room for exceptions. There was no hidden clause, no suggestion that perhaps in some circumstances, or for some greater goal, participation might be allowed. It was absolute. The Prophet would never bow to their idols, never stand before them in ritual, never offer even the smallest act that could be interpreted as acceptance. This level of clarity was necessary because the danger was not only in openly embracing falsehood, but in appearing to validate it, even symbolically. A single act, even if done with a different intention, could be taken as approval, and approval would open the door to confusion. People would begin to question the difference between truth and falsehood, wondering if both could coexist, if both could be acceptable in their own ways. But Islam does not allow that kind of uncertainty to take root. It protects the purity of belief by removing every possibility of misinterpretation, and this statement did exactly that. At the same time, it was not delivered with hostility or aggression. There was no insult, no mockery, no attempt to provoke. It was firm, but it was also composed, grounded in a calm certainty that did not need to raise its voice to be heard. This balance is important because it shows that strength in faith does not require harshness in tone. It is possible to stand firmly without becoming confrontational, to reject falsehood without demeaning those who follow it. The message was clear, but it was also dignified, and that dignity gave it even greater power. Then came the continuation, turning the focus outward once again. Nor are you worshippers of what I worship. This statement revealed something deeper than a simple difference in practice. It exposed a fundamental divide in understanding. The leaders of Quraysh believed, at least in part, that they recognized Allah. They did not deny His existence entirely, but they surrounded that recognition with layers of association, placing idols as intermediaries, attributing power to created things, and shaping their worship according to inherited traditions rather than divine guidance. In their minds, this still counted as worshipping the same God, just in a different way, but this verse dismantled that assumption completely. It made it clear that true worship is not defined by claims or intentions alone, but by how it is carried out, by its sincerity, and by its alignment with the truth revealed by Allah. This is where the depth of the message becomes even more apparent. It was not only rejecting their practices, it was correcting their understanding. It was saying, in essence, that what you are doing cannot be considered the same as what has been revealed, no matter how similar it might appear on the surface. Worship is not something that can be reshaped by culture or tradition. It is not something that evolves according to human preference. It is defined by revelation, and once it is altered, it no longer holds its original meaning. By stating that they were not worshippers of what he worshipped, the surah drew a clear distinction that could not be blurred by shared language or overlapping concepts. This also carried a profound implication for the idea of unity. The proposal of Quraysh was built on the assumption that unity could be achieved by finding common ground, by softening differences and creating a space where multiple beliefs could coexist without conflict. But this verse showed that true unity cannot be built on compromised truth. It cannot exist when the foundation itself is unstable, when the core principles are adjusted to accommodate opposing views. Instead, it established that real clarity, even if it leads to separation, is more valuable than a false sense of unity that hides fundamental differences. There is also a subtle but powerful protection within these words. By clearly stating that they were not worshippers of what he worshipped, it removed any expectation that their practices could somehow align with Islam over time, without a complete transformation. It prevented the idea that gradual blending or partial acceptance could lead to the same outcome. It made it clear that the path to true worship is not through compromise, but through complete submission to the truth as revealed. Anything less would remain fundamentally different, no matter how close it might seem. And yet, even in this firm separation, there is a sense of honesty that invites reflection. It does not force acceptance, it does not demand immediate change, but it presents the reality as it is, without distortion. It allows those who hear it to recognize the difference for themselves, to see the line that has been drawn, and to decide where they stand. This is part of what makes the message so enduring. It does not rely on pressure or manipulation. It relies on clarity, on truth presented in its pure form, leaving no room for confusion, but also no room for coercion. In that moment, the leaders of Quraysh were faced with something they could not easily respond to. Their proposal had been built on the assumption that everything could be negotiated, that every belief could be adjusted to fit a shared arrangement. But this response showed that there are boundaries that cannot be crossed, principles that cannot be altered, and truths that do not bend to accommodate opposing views. It was not just a rejection of their offer, it was a lesson that would echo far beyond that encounter, teaching that faith is not defined by convenience, but by conviction, and that conviction must remain firm even when the world around it pushes for compromise. There are moments when a message is repeated not because the listener failed to hear it the first time, but because its meaning must be carved deeply, leaving no space for doubt, no room for misinterpretation, and no opportunity for distortion. This is exactly what unfolds as the words continue, echoing with deliberate force, reinforcing what has already been made clear, yet pushing it even further into certainty. Nor will I be a worshipper of what you worship, nor will you be worshippers of what I worship. The repetition is not redundant. It is intentional, and it carries a rhythm that feels almost like a closing of every possible door that compromise might try to slip through. It is as if every angle has been considered, every potential loophole has been sealed, and every attempt to soften the boundary has been firmly shut down. What makes this repetition so powerful is that it shifts the message beyond the present moment and anchors it into the future. Earlier, the statements addressed what is happening now, what is being refused in that immediate exchange between the Prophet and the leaders of Quraysh. But here, the language extends forward, declaring that this separation is not temporary, not something that might change with time or circumstance. It is permanent, it is unwavering, it is not influenced by pressure, by negotiation, or by the passage of time. This is a declaration that faith is not shaped by convenience. It does not evolve to accommodate those who reject it, nor does it bend to create harmony at the cost of truth. Instead, it stands firm, consistent, and unchanged, regardless of who accepts it and who turns away. Imagine the effect of hearing this in that moment. The leaders of Quraysh had come with confidence, believing they had found a solution that could preserve their influence while containing the message of Islam. They expected discussion, perhaps resistance, but ultimately a negotiation, something that could be adjusted until both sides found a comfortable balance. Instead, they were met with something entirely different. Not a debate, not a counter-proposal, but a declaration that refused to enter the space they had created. The repetition made it impossible to reinterpret the message in their favor. It was not just a refusal of their specific offer, it was a complete rejection of the idea that such an offer could ever be acceptable under any circumstance. There is also a deeper wisdom in the way this repetition is structured. It addresses both sides equally, removing any illusion that compromise could come from either direction. It does not only say that the Prophet will not worship what they worship, it also states that they will not worship what he worships. This balance is important because it acknowledges the reality that true belief is not something that can be imposed or borrowed temporarily. It must come from within, from sincere recognition of truth. Without that sincerity, even if someone were to imitate the outward form of worship, it would not carry the same meaning. By stating this so clearly, the surah eliminates any expectation that a shared arrangement could lead to genuine unity. It makes it clear that unity in faith requires complete alignment, not partial overlap. The repetition also serves as a kind of protection, not only for the prophet, but for the message itself and for those who would follow it in the future. It establishes a principle that cannot be diluted, no matter how circumstances might change. In every generation, there will be pressures, sometimes subtle, sometimes overwhelming, to adjust beliefs in order to fit into a wider society, to avoid conflict, or to gain acceptance. There will always be voices suggesting that a small compromise here or there is harmless, that it does not change the essence of faith. But these words stand as a reminder that even small compromises, when it comes to the core of belief, can lead to a gradual erosion of truth. By repeating the separation so clearly, the surah builds a barrier against that erosion, a barrier that remains intact across time. And then comes the final statement, the one that closes the surah with a sense of calm certainty that feels both firm and composed. To you is your religion, and to me is my religion. At first glance, it might seem like a simple conclusion, almost a peaceful resolution after a strong refusal, but its meaning is far deeper than it appears. This is not a statement of approval for all beliefs, nor is it a suggestion that all paths are equally valid. It is a declaration of separation, an acknowledgement that truth and falsehood will not merge, that each will remain distinct, and that each will carry its own consequences. There is a dignity in this statement that is striking. It does not insult, it does not attack, and it does not attempt to force change. Instead, it draws a clear boundary and then steps back, allowing that boundary to stand on its own. It says, in essence, that the message has been delivered, the truth has been made clear, and now each person is responsible for their own choice. This reflects a fundamental principle in Islam, that guidance comes from Allah and that people are not compelled into belief by force. The role of the Prophet is to convey the message, not to control how it is received. At the same time, this statement carries a quiet strength that should not be overlooked. It is not a sign of weakness or resignation. It is not saying that all beliefs are the same or that it does not matter what people choose. Rather, it is asserting that the truth stands independently, that it does not need validation from those who reject it, and that it will not be altered to gain their approval. It is a confident declaration that faith does not rely on consensus to be true. For the leaders of Quraysh, this must have been both unexpected and unsettling. They came seeking a compromise that would allow them to maintain control, but instead, they were given a response that removed their influence entirely from the equation. There was no negotiation left, no middle ground to explore, no shared space to occupy. The line had been drawn, clearly and permanently, and it was not going to move. What remains most powerful about this ending is the balance it achieves. It combines firmness with respect, clarity with composure, and conviction with restraint. It shows that standing for truth does not require aggression, and that rejecting falsehood does not mean abandoning dignity. It sets a standard for how differences in belief should be handled, not through forced agreement or diluted principles, but through honest recognition of where each side stands. And in that final declaration, there is a sense of closure that resonates beyond that specific moment in Mecca. It speaks to every situation where truth is challenged by compromise, where pressure is applied to soften what should remain firm. It reminds that faith is not something to be reshaped by external demands, but something to be held with clarity and confidence, even when it sets one apart. It is a statement that continues to echo, not as a relic of the past, but as a living principle, guiding those who hear it toward a faith that is pure, unambiguous, and unshaken by the shifting expectations of the world. There are certain moments in Revelation where a few short verses carry a weight far greater than their length, where the words seem simple on the surface, yet hold within them a force that protects an entire belief system from being reshaped, diluted, or misunderstood. This surah became exactly that kind of shield. It did not introduce a new law, it did not narrate a long story, and it did not engage in extended argument. yet it carved out something essential, something that would define the identity of Islam with unmistakable clarity. It established that the foundation of faith is not negotiable, that the oneness of Allah stands beyond compromise, and that once this foundation is altered, everything built upon it begins to collapse. In a society where traditions were deeply rooted and compromise was often seen as wisdom, this surah introduced a different kind of wisdom, one that prioritizes truth over convenience and certainty over acceptance. What makes this even more remarkable is how early in the mission this message was delivered. The Muslim community at that time was small, vulnerable, and under constant pressure. There were no signs of worldly strength, no political power, and no protection from the hostility that surrounded them. In such a situation, many might assume that flexibility would be the wiser path, that softening the message could reduce tension and allow it to spread more easily. But revelation did not follow that logic. Instead, it did the opposite. It reinforced the core of belief at a time when it might have seemed most tempting to ease its edges. This tells us something profound about the nature of truth in Islam. It is not strengthened by compromise, and it is not made more acceptable by blending it with opposing ideas. Its strength lies in its clarity, in its purity, and in its refusal to be reshaped by external pressure. This surah became a defining line, not only for that moment, but for every moment that would follow. It answered a question that would arise again and again throughout history. How should a believer respond when asked to adjust their faith to fit into a broader acceptance? The answer is not found in long debates or complex arguments, but in the same clarity that these verses carry. Faith is not a social agreement. It is not a shared space where every belief holds equal ground. It is a commitment to truth as revealed by Allah, and that commitment demands consistency. When that consistency is maintained, the identity of faith remains intact. When it is compromised, even slightly, it begins to lose its shape. At the same time, this surah does not promote isolation or hostility. It does not call for aggression, nor does it encourage unnecessary conflict. Instead, it teaches a balance that is often misunderstood. It shows that one can stand firmly in belief while still maintaining dignity and composure. It allows for coexistence without agreement, for interaction without assimilation. This balance is crucial because it prevents two extremes. On one side, there is the danger of compromise, where faith is diluted in the name of harmony. On the other side, there is the danger of harshness, where differences lead to unnecessary hostility. This surah avoids both. It stands in the middle, firm in its principles, yet calm in its expression, clear in its message, yet respectful in its tone. Then there is the example of the Prophet himself, peace be upon him, who embodied this message with complete sincerity. When the surah was revealed, he did not hesitate, he did not soften its words, and he did not adjust its meaning to make it more acceptable to those around him. He delivered it exactly as it came, with full conviction, even though he knew it would not please the leaders of Quraysh. This is what makes his role so powerful. He was not driven by personal interest, nor was he influenced by the desire to gain approval. His commitment was to the truth alone, and that commitment guided every response he gave. Authentic narrations show that this surah held a special place in his daily life. It was not only a response to a specific situation, it became a regular part of his worship. He would recite it in his prayers, particularly in the voluntary prayers before dawn and after sunset. This consistent recitation is significant because it shows that the message of the surah is not limited to a historical moment. It is a constant reminder, something to be repeated, reflected upon, and carried into daily life. Each time it is recited, it reinforces the same principle, that worship belongs to Allah alone, and that this truth does not change with time or circumstance. There is also a deeper lesson in the way the Prophet lived this message beyond the words themselves. Even while maintaining a clear separation in belief, He continued to interact with those who rejected the message. He traded with them, spoke with them, and showed kindness and fairness in his dealings. This demonstrates that firmness in faith does not require cutting off all interaction. It simply requires clarity in where one stands. The boundary is in belief, not in basic human conduct. This distinction is important because it prevents misunderstanding the message as one of division in every sense. It is not a call to isolate, but a call to remain grounded in truth while navigating the world with integrity. For those who followed him, this surah became a source of strength, especially in times of pressure. It reminded them that they did not need to reshape their beliefs to fit into the expectations of others. It gave them a sense of identity, a clear understanding of what they stood for and why it mattered. In a world where voices often compete to influence beliefs, this clarity becomes even more valuable. It acts as an anchor, keeping the heart steady when external pressures try to pull it in different directions. And perhaps one of the most powerful aspects of this surah is how it achieves all of this with such simplicity. There are no complicated arguments, no detailed explanations, no lengthy justifications, just a few verses, repeated with purpose, delivered with clarity, and lived with sincerity. This simplicity is not a limitation, it is a strength. It makes the message accessible, easy to remember, and impossible to distort. Anyone who hears it can understand it. Anyone who reflects on it can feel its weight. And anyone who holds on to it can find within it a foundation that does not shake. In the end, what this surah establishes is not just a response to a proposal made long ago, but a principle that continues to guide believers in every time and place. It reminds that faith is not something to be negotiated, that truth does not need to be adjusted to gain acceptance, and that standing firm does not require harshness, only certainty. And through the example of the Prophet, peace be upon him, it shows that this balance is not only possible, but powerful, shaping a way of life that is both grounded in conviction and guided by wisdom. There is something deeply defining about knowing exactly where you stand, especially in a world that constantly pushes people to blur their boundaries, soften their convictions, and reshape their beliefs to fit whatever is most convenient or widely accepted. This surah does not simply respond to a historical moment. It builds an identity. It answers a question that lives quietly in every heart that believes, a question that becomes louder whenever pressure begins to rise. Who are you when your faith is tested, when compromise is offered in a way that seems harmless, even reasonable? The answer that emerges from these verses is not complicated, but it is powerful. A believer is someone who knows that worship belongs to Allah alone, without division, without negotiation, and without apology. This clarity becomes the foundation upon which everything else is built. Without it, identity becomes fragile, easily shaped by external influences, easily lost in the noise of competing ideas. In the early days of Islam, this sense of identity was not just important, it was essential for survival. The believers were few, surrounded by a society that rejected their message and often punished them for holding on to it. In such an environment, it would have been easy to feel uncertain, to question whether holding firmly to their beliefs was worth the cost. But this surah strengthened them from within. It gave them a clear understanding that their faith was not something to be adjusted for the sake of acceptance, and that their value did not come from fitting into the expectations of others, but from their connection to Allah. This kind of identity creates resilience. It allows a person to stand firm even when standing alone, because their sense of purpose is not tied to the approval of those around them. What makes this even more relevant is that the pressure to compromise does not always come in obvious forms. It rarely presents itself as a direct attack on faith. More often, it appears as a gentle suggestion, a small adjustment, a way to make things easier, smoother, more acceptable. It whispers that a slight change will not make a difference, that holding on to every principle might be unnecessary, that blending in is better than standing out, And this is where the lesson of this surah becomes so critical. It teaches that faith is not measured only in moments of open challenge, but also in those subtle moments where the line between truth and compromise begins to blur. Knowing where you stand means recognizing those moments and responding with the same clarity that these verses carry. At the same time, this identity is not built on arrogance or a sense of superiority. It is grounded in humility, in the recognition that guidance comes from Allah alone. A believer does not hold on to faith because they are better than others, but because they have been shown the truth and they choose to remain committed to it. This humility is what keeps the identity balanced. It prevents firmness from turning into harshness, and it allows a person to maintain dignity even when facing opposition. The surah does not teach isolation or hostility. It teaches clarity with composure, strength with restraint, and conviction with wisdom. There is also a profound sense of freedom that comes with this kind of identity. When a person no longer feels the need to adjust their beliefs to gain acceptance, they are no longer controlled by the expectations of others. They are no longer pulled in different directions by competing pressures. Instead, they are anchored in something thabit, something that does not change with time or circumstance. This freedom is not about doing whatever one desires, but about being firmly connected to a truth that provides direction and purpose. It removes confusion and replaces it with certainty. And that certainty brings a kind of peace that cannot be found in constantly shifting beliefs. And then there is the strength that comes from drawing clear boundaries, something that this surah demonstrates with remarkable precision. Boundaries are often misunderstood. Some see them as barriers that create division, while others see them as signs of rigidity. But in reality, boundaries are what protect what matters most. Without them, everything begins to blend together, and once that happens, it becomes difficult to distinguish truth from falsehood, right from wrong, meaningful from meaningless. This surah does not create boundaries out of hostility, it creates them out of necessity. It shows that in matters of faith, clarity is not optional, it is essential. What is striking is how these boundaries are established without aggression. There is no call to force others into belief, no demand for conformity, no attempt to erase differences through pressure. Instead, the surah acknowledges those differences openly and then defines the line that separates them. This approach is both firm and respectful. It allows for coexistence, but not at the cost of compromising core beliefs. It teaches that it is possible to live among others, to interact, to coexist peacefully, while still holding firmly to one's faith without dilution. This balance is something that many struggle to maintain. On one side, there is the temptation to compromise in order to avoid conflict, to blend in so completely that the distinct identity of faith begins to fade. On the other side, there is the temptation to become harsh, to treat differences as reasons for hostility rather than opportunities for clarity. This surah avoids both extremes. It shows that strength does not require aggression, and that maintaining boundaries does not require cutting off all connection. It presents a model of engagement that is both grounded and composed, firm yet measured. There is also an important lesson in understanding that boundaries are not only about others, they are also about protecting oneself. When a believer clearly defines what they accept and what they reject, they create a space where their faith can grow without interference. They are less likely to be influenced by ideas that contradict their beliefs and more likely to remain consistent in their actions. This consistency is what builds integrity, and integrity is what allows faith to remain strong over time. In the broader sense, this surah teaches that not every difference needs to be resolved through agreement. Some differences are fundamental, and trying to merge them only leads to confusion. Recognizing this does not create division, it creates clarity. It allows each side to understand where they stand, and it removes the illusion that all paths lead to the same place. This clarity is not meant to push people apart unnecessarily, but to ensure that truth remains distinct and recognizable. And so, what emerges from these verses is not just a statement of belief, but a way of being. It is a way of standing firm without becoming rigid, of maintaining boundaries without becoming distant, and of holding on to truth without losing humility. It is a reminder that identity and faith is not something that is inherited passively, but something that must be understood, protected, and lived with intention. And in a world that often encourages compromise as the easiest path, this surah offers something different, a path that may not always be easy, but is always clear, always grounded, and always aligned with the truth that does not change. There is something quietly powerful about the way certain parts of the Quran move beyond a single moment in history and become part of daily life, repeating themselves not just in memory, but in action, in rhythm, in the way a believer structures their connection with Allah. This surah is one of those rare pieces of revelation that did not remain confined to the context in which it was revealed, but instead became a regular companion in the life of the Prophet, peace be upon him. Authentic narrations tell us that he would recite it consistently in specific voluntary prayers, especially in the 2 units of prayer before the dawn prayer and after the sunset prayer. This was not random, and it was not occasional. It was intentional, repeated, and deeply meaningful. Every time he stood in those quiet moments, before the world fully awakened or as the day began to settle into darkness, he would recite words that reaffirmed the absolute oneness of Allah and the complete rejection of anything that competes with that truth. Think about what that means for a moment. These are times of the day that naturally invite reflection. Before dawn, when the world is still and the distractions have not yet begun, and after sunset, when the day's noise fades and a sense of calm returns. To place this surah within those moments is to anchor the heart in clarity at the beginning and the end of each day. It is as if the believer is being reminded again and again that no matter what happens between those 2 points, no matter what pressures arise, what conversations take place, or what influences attempt to shape the mind, the foundation remains unchanged. Worship belongs to Allah alone. There is no compromise in that, no adjustment, no negotiation. It is a truth that frames the entire day, from its first light to its final stillness. This repetition is not empty habit, it is reinforcement. It is training the heart to remain firm even when the environment shifts. When something is repeated consistently in moments of sincerity, it begins to settle deeper than words. It becomes part of how a person sees the world, how they respond to challenges, how they make decisions. The Prophet, peace be upon him, did not just deliver this message once and move on. He lived it, and he repeated it in a way that ensured it would remain alive within him and within those who followed him. This is how the Quran transforms from text into lived reality. It is not only understood, it is practiced, repeated, and allowed to shape the inner state of a person. There is also something deeply protective in this practice. The world is filled with ideas, influences, and subtle pressures that can slowly begin to blur the clarity of belief if left unchecked. Not all of these influences are obvious. Some come in the form of cultural expectations, others in the form of social acceptance, and others still in the quiet suggestions that encourage a person to soften their stance just enough to avoid standing out. Over time, without a strong anchor, these small influences can accumulate, creating confusion where there was once certainty. But by returning to this surah regularly, by reciting it in moments of focus and sincerity, the believer is constantly realigning themselves. It is like recalibrating a compass, ensuring that no matter how far one travels, the direction remains true. And then there is the deeper spiritual effect of this repetition. Each time these words are recited, they are not only spoken outwardly, they are heard inwardly. They remind the heart of its purpose, of its allegiance, of its ultimate destination. They cut through distractions and bring everything back to a single, clear point. This is what gives the surah its strength. It is not long, it does not require extended explanation, yet its impact is immediate and profound. It simplifies what can often feel complex, reducing everything down to its essence. Who do you worship, and how do you worship? Once that is clear, everything else begins to fall into place. At the same time, this surah serves as a shield, not just against external pressures, but against internal doubt. Doubt does not always arrive in dramatic ways. Sometimes it is quiet, subtle, almost unnoticeable at first. It begins as a question, a hesitation, a moment of uncertainty. If left unaddressed, it can grow, slowly weakening the clarity of belief. But this surah cuts through that uncertainty with directness. It does not engage in long arguments or complex reasoning. It states the truth plainly, firmly, and repeatedly. This simplicity is what makes it so effective as a shield. It does not allow doubt to linger or expand. It confronts it immediately, replacing it with certainty. There is also a psychological strength that comes from this clarity. When a person knows exactly where they stand, they are less likely to be shaken by external opinions. They are not constantly adjusting themselves to fit into different environments, not constantly questioning whether they should modify their beliefs to gain acceptance. Instead, they carry a steady sense of identity that remains consistent regardless of where they are or who they are with. This consistency brings a kind of inner peace. It removes the tension that comes from trying to please conflicting expectations, and it replaces it with a calm confidence that comes from being aligned with truth. And yet, this strength does not isolate the believer from the world. It does not create a barrier that prevents interaction or engagement. Instead, it allows for interaction without confusion. A person can engage with others, work with them, speak with them, and live among them, while still maintaining a clear sense of who they are and what they believe. This is an important distinction because it shows that strength in faith does not require withdrawal. It requires clarity. When that clarity is present, engagement becomes easier, not harder, because there is no fear of losing one's identity in the process. There is also a sense of continuity in this practice that connects the believer to the Prophet himself. Every time this surah is recited in those quiet moments of prayer, it echoes a practice that has been carried through generations. It is a link, a connection that stretches back to the earliest days of Islam, reminding the believer that they are part of something larger, something that has been preserved with care and consistency. This connection adds depth to the act of recitation. It is not just a personal practice, it is part of a living tradition that has been maintained by countless hearts before. In the end, what this surah offers is not just a statement of belief, but a method of preservation. It teaches that clarity must be maintained actively, not assumed to remain on its own. It shows that faith is strengthened through repetition, through consistent return to its core principles, and through deliberate moments of reflection that keep the heart aligned with its purpose. And in a world that constantly shifts, that constantly introduces new ideas and new pressures, this kind of steady, repeated affirmation becomes not just beneficial, but essential. It is what keeps the foundation strong, what protects the identity of belief, and what allows a person to move through life with a sense of certainty that does not fade, no matter how much the world around them changes. There is something remarkable about how a message revealed in a specific moment, in response to a very particular situation, can carry a relevance that stretches far beyond its origin, reaching into every era, every society, and every individual who encounters it. This surah is not confined to the streets of Mecca or the tension between the Prophet and the leaders of Quraysh. It lives on as a response to every form of pressure that seeks to reshape belief, every voice that suggests compromise as a solution, and every situation where truth is asked to bend in order to fit into a broader acceptance. The world changes, cultures evolve, and societies shift, yet the core challenge remains the same. There will always be moments when standing firm feels difficult, when the easier path appears to be adjustment, when the idea of blending in seems more appealing than standing apart. And in those moments, this surah speaks with the same clarity it carried when it was first revealed. It is easy to think of compromise as something harmless, especially when it comes wrapped in language that emphasizes peace, unity, and mutual respect. These are values that are important, values that Islam itself upholds. But what this surah teaches is that not all forms of unity are built on truth, and not all forms of peace preserve what is essential. There is a kind of unity that comes from shared understanding and genuine alignment. And then there is a kind that is created by ignoring differences or softening them to the point where they lose their meaning. The latter may feel comfortable in the short term, but it carries a hidden cost. It slowly erodes the clarity of belief, turning what was once firm into something uncertain, something that can be reshaped again and again until it no longer resembles its original form. This surah stands as a safeguard against that process. It reminds that truth does not need to be adjusted to be accepted, and that acceptance gained through compromise is not the same as acceptance grounded in sincerity. Every generation faces its own version of this test. In some times, the pressure is direct and obvious, a clear challenge to belief that demands a clear response. In other times, it is subtle, woven into the fabric of daily life, appearing in conversations, expectations, and unspoken norm. It might come in the form of being encouraged to downplay certain aspects of faith, to treat them as private rather than central, or to present them in a way that feels more acceptable to others. It might come in the suggestion that holding firmly to certain principles is unnecessary, that flexibility is a sign of maturity, that conviction should be balanced with adaptation. These ideas can sound reasonable, even wise, but they carry the same underlying assumption that the leaders of Quraysh held, that truth can be adjusted without losing its essence. This surah challenges that assumption directly, showing that once the core is compromised, everything built upon it begins to shift. At the same time, it is important to recognize that the surah does not call for rigidity in every aspect of life. It does not reject interaction, cooperation, or coexistence. Islam encourages kindness, fairness, and good character in dealing with others, regardless of their beliefs. The Prophet himself demonstrated this repeatedly, maintaining relationships, engaging in trade, and showing compassion even toward those who opposed him. The firmness that this surah teaches is specific to matters of belief, to the core principles that define faith. It draws a line between what can be flexible and what cannot, between what can adapt to circumstances and what must remain thatched. Understanding this distinction is key because it prevents misinterpretation. It allows a believer to navigate the world with wisdom, maintaining strong principles while still engaging with others in a way that reflects the akhlaq of Islam. There is also a sense of empowerment in this message that is often overlooked. When a person knows that they are not required to reshape their beliefs to fit into every environment, they are freed from a constant pressure that many people carry without realizing it. They no longer feel the need to explain away their faith, to soften it, or to present it in a way that seeks approval. Instead, they can stand with quiet confidence, knowing that truth does not depend on how widely it is accepted. This kind of confidence is not loud or confrontational. It is calm, steady, and rooted in certainty. It allows a person to remain consistent, not shifting with every change in their surroundings, but remaining anchored in something that does not change. And then there is the tone of the surah itself, which carries a wisdom that is just as important as its message. Despite its firmness, it is not harsh. It does not attack, it does not insult, and it does not provoke unnecessary conflict. It speaks with clarity, but also with composure, presenting the truth in a way that is direct yet dignified. This balance is essential because it shows that strength in faith does not require aggression. It is possible to reject falsehood without demeaning those who follow it, to stand firm without becoming hostile, and to maintain boundaries without creating unnecessary division. This tone reflects a deeper understanding of how truth is best conveyed. Harshness can close hearts, while clarity combined with dignity can open them. The surah does not attempt to force belief, because belief cannot be forced. It can only be accepted through sincere recognition of truth. By presenting the message in this way, it leaves space for reflection, for those who hear it to consider it without feeling attacked. It maintains the integrity of the message while also preserving the akhlaq that should accompany it. There is also a lesson here about patience. The Prophet did not respond to the proposal with anger or frustration. He waited for revelation, and when it came, he delivered it exactly as it was given, without adding to it or taking away from it. This shows a level of trust and restraint that is essential in conveying truth. It is not about reacting emotionally to every challenge, but about responding with wisdom, guided by what has been revealed. This patience adds to the strength of the message, because it shows that it is not driven by impulse, but by certainty. As time moves forward, the relevance of this surah becomes even more apparent. The forms of pressure may change, the language used to suggest compromise may evolve, but the core challenge remains the same. Will truth remain clear, or will it be adjusted to fit into changing circumstances? This surah answers that question with unwavering consistency. It reminds that while the world may change, the foundation of faith does not. It stands as a constant, a reference point that believers can return to whenever they feel uncertain, whenever they are faced with choices that challenge their convictions. And in that sense, this surah is not just a response to a moment in history. It is a companion for every moment that follows, a steady voice that cuts through confusion and brings everything back to its essence. It teaches that clarity is not something to be feared, that standing firm does not mean standing alone, and that truth, when held with sincerity and conveyed with dignity, carries a qut that does not fade with time. There is a moment in every journey of belief when everything becomes clear, not in a loud or dramatic way, but in a quiet certainty that settles deep within the heart. It is the moment when the line between truth and falsehood is no longer blurred, when confusion gives way to clarity, and when a person understands, without hesitation, what they stand for and what they will never stand for. This surah represents that moment. It draws a line that is not meant to divide people for the sake of division, but to protect the essence of faith from being lost in compromise. On one side is pure monotheism, the worship of Allah alone, without partners, without intermediaries, without distortion. On the other side is everything that departs from that, whether it appears close to the truth or stands far from it. The strength of this surah lies in the fact that it does not attempt to soften that line or make it less visible. It makes it unmistakably clear, because without that clarity, faith itself begins to lose its definition. What is powerful about this is not only the firmness of the line, but the wisdom behind it. When boundaries are unclear, people begin to drift. They move gradually, often without realizing it, adjusting their beliefs to fit circumstances, adopting ideas that seem harmless at first, and slowly losing the distinct identity that once defined them. This is not something that happens suddenly. It happens in small steps, each one seeming insignificant on its own, but together, leading to a complete transformation. This surah prevents that process before it even begins. It establishes a boundary that is clear, stable, and resistant to change. It does not leave room for gradual erosion, because it defines the core of faith in a way that cannot be reshaped without being completely altered. There is also a sense of protection in this clarity. When a person knows exactly where the line is, they are less likely to cross it unintentionally. They are able to recognize when something challenges their beliefs, even if it is presented in a subtle or appealing way. This awareness becomes a form of guidance, helping them navigate situations that might otherwise lead to confusion. It is not about living in fear of making mistakes, but about having a clear reference point that keeps them aligned with what is true. This is why the surah does not engage in long explanations. It does not need to. Its clarity is its strength. It presents the boundary in a way that is direct and unmistakable, allowing anyone who hears it to understand it immediately. At the same time, this line does not create hostility. It does not call for conflict or division in every aspect of life. It simply defines belief, leaving space for interaction, coexistence, and even kindness across that boundary. This is an important distinction, because it shows that clarity does not require harshness. A person can be firm in their beliefs while still being respectful in their conduct. They can recognize differences without turning those differences into reasons for hostility. This balance is what gives the surah its enduring qut. It is not only clear, it is also composed, allowing truth to stand on its own without being accompanied by unnecessary aggression. And then there is the lasting echo of these words, something that continues long after the moment in which they were first revealed. When these verses are recited today, they carry the same firmness, the same certainty, the same refusal to compromise. They do not feel distant or outdated. They feel immediate, relevant, as if they are speaking directly into the present moment. This is one of the remarkable qualities of the Quran. Its message is not tied to a specific time or place. It addresses human nature, and human nature does not change. The pressures may look different, the language may evolve, but the underlying challenges remain the same. People still face moments where they are asked to adjust their beliefs, to soften their convictions, to blend their identity with the expectations around them. And in those moments, this surah responds with the same clarity it always has. There is something deeply grounding about returning to these words again and again. Each recitation feels like a reaffirmation, a reminder that no matter how complex life becomes, the foundation remains simple and clear. Worship belongs to Allah alone. That truth does not shift with circumstances. It does not become less relevant with time. It does not need to be reshaped to remain meaningful. It stands unchanged, offering a sense of stability in a world that is constantly changing. This stability is what gives believers strength. It allows them to move through life with confidence, not because they have all the answers to every question, but because they are anchored in something that does not change. They do not need to redefine themselves with every new trend or adapt their beliefs to match every new idea. Instead, they carry a consistent identity, one that remains steady regardless of external influences. This consistency is not restrictive. It is liberating. It frees a person from the constant pressure to conform, allowing them to live with a sense of purpose that is not dependent on approval or acceptance. At the same time, this surah invites reflection. It encourages a person to look inward and ask themselves where they truly stand. It is easy to repeat words, to recite verses, to acknowledge beliefs outwardly. But the real question is whether those beliefs are held with the same clarity and conviction that these verses express. Do they remain firm when challenged, or do they begin to shift under pressure? Do they guide decisions, or are they set aside when they become inconvenient? These are not questions that require immediate answers, but they are important to consider because they reveal the depth of one's connection to the truth. And perhaps one of the most powerful aspects of this surah is that it does not leave a person in confusion. It does not present a complex philosophy that requires extensive interpretation. It presents a clear choice, a clear boundary, and a clear identity. It says, in essence, that truth is distinct, that it does not merge with falsehood, and that each person must recognize where they stand in relation to that truth. This clarity is both a gift and a responsibility. It simplifies what can often feel overwhelming, but it also removes excuses. Once the line is clear, the choice becomes clear as well. In the end, What remains is not just a set of verses, but a lasting principle that continues to shape the lives of those who hold on to it. It is a reminder that faith is not something to be negotiated, that truth does not depend on acceptance, and that clarity is not something to be avoided, but something to be embraced. And as these words continue to be recited, generation after generation, they carry the same coot, the same certainty, the same unshakable declaration that has stood firm since the moment it was revealed. A declaration that truth remains truth, no matter how the world around it changes, and that those who hold on to it will always have a foundation that does not break.